A father's quiet strength is tested when guards challenge his place at his son's graduation. But 5 warriors rise silently from the crowd, their presence a thrilling promise of loyalty. Welcome to Lifebond Tales. Comment from where you are watching this story. Marcus Everett guided his Ford pickup into the packed parking lot of Westview Community College in rural Georgia, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the faded blue paint of a truck that had carried his family through countless humid southern summers, a vehicle his late wife Lena had cherished for impromptu road trips to Savannah or quiet drives to her favorite peach orchard. The auditorium stood unassuming, a low brick structure with Class of 2025 banners fluttering above the entrance, surrounded by a lively crowd of families clutching balloons, homemade signs and cameras, their voices blending into a warm hum of anticipation. Marcus stepped out, his army dress uniform crisp and deep green, the fabric hugging his broad shoulders, his polished boots gleaming not for vanity, but because precision was etched into his being after 2 decades of service. A black man in his late 40s, his face bore the weight of both strength and a quiet sorrow. His upright posture a silent salute to the moment he had driven 10 hours from Fort Bragg to witness, his son, Caleb's associate degree commencement. Lena's absence, a wound still raw from her passing 3 years ago to cancer, hung over him like a shadow. But today was about a promise kept, to be there for Caleb, to stand in the space Lena would have filled with her radiant pride. From the glove compartment, he retrieved a small faded photo, its edges worn from years of handling, showing Lena cradling baby Caleb, her smile a beacon against the creased paper. He slipped it into his jacket pocket, murmuring, "We made it, love," his voice soft but steady. The walk to the auditorium was slow, each step deliberate, his boots clicking against the asphalt as if marking time, his chest tight with a mix of pride for Caleb's achievement and the ache of Lena's absence, her memory woven into every choice he made today. Inside, the auditorium buzzed with life, the air thick with the scent of fresh paint, coffee, and the faint sweetness of flowers pinned to dresses. Metal chairs lined the floor, bleachers overflowed with families, some laughing, others fussing over crooked ties or snapping photos of gowned students. Marcus handed his printed ticket to a volunteer, a young woman with a clipboard who offered a nervous smile, her eyes lingering on his uniform before she pointed to the front row, reserved for family, and turned away. He moved through the crowd, his presence drawing glances, some curious, some warm, a few guarded, in a small town where military uniforms were rare, but history ran deep, layered with unspoken tensions. He found his seat, a wobbly plastic chair, and adjusted it without complaint, settling in with his hands resting lightly on his knees, his gaze fixed on the stage where banners hung proudly, and faculty in academic regalia shuffled papers, preparing for the ceremony. Caleb was out there among the students, 19 and lanky. With Lena's thoughtful eyes and a quiet determination Marcus saw as a reflection of his own resilience. The crowd's noise, chairs scraping, a toddler's giggle, a parent's loud call to a wayward child, swirled around him, but Marcus remained still, the photo in his pocket a grounding anchor, its weight a reminder of the family he carried with him. He thought of the years deployments had stolen, nights when Lena's letters kept him sane, her words urging him to come home whole for Caleb. Those memories surfaced now, vivid and sharp. Caleb's first steps in a dusty base housing unit, Lena's laughter during a rare stateside leave, the hospital room where she made him promise to never miss Caleb's big moments. Marcus's stillness stood out in the chaotic hum, a man who had faced deserts and danger, yet carried a heart heavy with love and loss, here to honor his son's step into the future. His eyes scanned the rows of students, searching for Caleb, knowing he'd be standing tall, maybe nervous but steady, carrying the same quiet strength Marcus had seen in him since he was a boy, building model planes at the kitchen table. The auditorium pulsed with anticipation, but for Marcus it was as if the world had narrowed to this moment, this chair, this day he'd crossed half a state to reach, driven by a vow to Lena and a love for Caleb that no distance could erode. He adjusted his cuffs, the silver bars on his uniform catching the light, not for show but because they represented every sacrifice, every mission, Every night he'd stared at that photo under starless skies. The crowd's energy ebbed and flowed, but Marcus remained a fixed point, a soldier and a father, his heart beating in rhythm with the promise he'd kept, ready to witness Caleb's triumph in a space that felt both ordinary and sacred. A Messiah. Auditorium at Westview Community College thrummed with restless energy. As Marcus Everett sat in his front row seat, the wobbly plastic chair creaking under his solid frame, his army dress uniform a stark contrast to the casual dresses and polo shirts around him. The confrontation began subtly, a ripple in the festive chaos, when two private security guards, Carter and Reese, approached with clipped strides, their black polo shirts emblazoned with Westview security stretched tight over their belts. Carter, stocky with a buzz cut and a scowl that seemed permanent, stopped beside Marcus and cleared his throat, his voice low but sharp, claiming the front row was reserved for priority guests, and Marcus needed to move to the back. Marcus, his face calm as still water, met Carter's gaze and produced his ticket, the paper crisp despite the long drive from Fort Bragg, stating clearly his right to the family section. His voice was steady, each word deliberate, explaining he'd driven 10 hours to see his son Caleb graduate, and he wasn't moving. Reese, taller and leaner, shifted uncomfortably, chewing gum with a nervous rhythm, but Carter leaned closer, his tone hardening, suggesting Marcus's uniform didn't belong in such a prominent spot, the words carrying a sting Marcus recognized from years of navigating spaces where his presence was questioned. The crowd nearby began to notice, heads turning, whispers spreading like ripples, a mother clutching a bouquet of roses, nudging her husband, an older man adjusting his glasses to watch. Marcus sat unmoved, his hands resting lightly on his thighs, the faded photo of Lena and baby Caleb pressing against his chest, grounding him as the guard's insistence grew. Carter's hand hovered near his radio, his eyes narrowing while Reese muttered about avoiding a scene, but Marcus's response was unwavering, his voice dropping lower, firmer, stating he'd stay unless physically forced, his calm a shield forged in years of facing worse than petty authority. A woman 2 seats over, her silver hair pinned neatly, leaned toward Marcus and whispered fiercely, "You stay right there, honey." Her support a quiet spark in the growing tension. The guards exchanged a glance, Carter's jaw tightening, as he spoke into his radio requesting backup, his words clipped and urgent while the auditorium's noise, students laughing, programs rustling, seemed to fade, the air thickening with anticipation. Marcus's eyes remained forward, locked on the stage where Caleb would soon walk, but his senses were sharp, trained to read the room, noting the subtle shift in the crowd's mood, some now openly staring, a teenager in the bleachers tilting, a phone to record. Carter stepped closer, his belt brushing Marcus's knee, his voice dropping to a near growl, implying Marcus was making trouble by refusing to comply. But Marcus's reply was a quiet blade, asking Carter to name who gave the order, his tone exposing the flimsiness of their authority. The moment teetered, the guard's frustration mounting, but Marcus remained a rock, his stillness a defiance that needed no words, his heart steady with the promise to Lena and the pride for Caleb burning bright. The ceremony's opening notes of pomp and circumstance began to play, but the music felt distant, the real rhythm pulsing in the standoff, the crowd now a living witness to a father's quiet stand, the weight of history and dignity hanging heavy in the air. The tension in the Westview Community College auditorium hung thick as the confrontation between Marcus Everett and the security guards, Carter and Reese, teetered on the edge of escalation. But the air shifted when 5 former Army Rangers, comrades from Marcus's past, began to rise from their seats across the room, their movements deliberate and silent, like wolves circling a threat. Daniel Pierce, a grizzled man with a salt-and-pepper beard and eyes that carried the weight of Mosul's dust, stood first, stepping into the aisle 3 rows back, his fitted black jacket doing little to hide the strength in his frame. His gaze locked on Carter with a calm that felt more dangerous than any shout. One by one, the others followed. Javier Torres, lean and sharp, positioned near the bleachers. Ethan Cole, broad and unyielding, standing at the back. Nathan Hayes, wiry with a scar tracing his jaw, rising near the stage. and Lucas Reed, quiet and watchful, taking a spot by the exit. They didn't speak, didn't signal each other, but their presence was a unified force, each man's posture mirroring Marcus's own, steady, alert, unyielding, a brotherhood, forged in the crucible of a 2009 ambush in Iraq, where Marcus had led them through a burning marketplace, dragging Daniel to safety under a hail of gunfire, his voice cutting through the chaos to keep them alive. Marcus's mind flickered to that day, the memory sharp as shrapnel. The marketplace's acrid smoke, the crack of AK-47s, Daniel's blood soaking his sleeve as Marcus hauled him across shattered cobblestones, shouting for Torres to cover there. Left while Cole laid down suppressing fire, their survival a testament to trust that needed no words. Back in the auditorium, Marcus didn't turn to acknowledge them, his eyes still fixed on the stage where Caleb stood among the gowned students. But he felt their presence like a steady pulse, a reminder of bonds that didn't fade with time. The crowd sensed it too, the whispers growing quieter, eyes darting between Marcus, the guards, and the men now standing, their silence louder than the ceremony's music, which faltered as the processional paused. Caleb, in the line of graduates, caught sight of the men, his heart racing as he recognized something in their stance, a connection to his father he'd only glimpsed in old photos or half-told stories of deployments, his mother's voice echoing in his mind about the men who'd send Christmas cards signed with just initials. Carter, oblivious to the weight of who he faced, muttered into his radio again, his voice betraying a flicker of unease as he noticed the men, while Reese stepped back, his gum-chewing slowing, his eyes scanning the room as if realizing they'd misjudged the situation. A student nearby whispered to a friend, pointing subtly, and a father in the bleachers set down his camera, his attention no longer on the stage, but on the unfolding drama, the air charged with a respect that didn't need explanation. Daniel took a single step forward, his voice low and clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're bothering a man who's here for his son. Walk away." Carter flinched, his hand dropping from his radio, but his pride kept him rooted, his face reddening as he snapped, "This isn't your business," only for Daniel to reply, "You made it ours." The other rangers shifted slightly, not closing, but adjusting their stances, a subtle signal that spoke of readiness, their eyes never leaving the guards. Marcus remained seated, his hands still on his thighs, the photo of Lena and Caleb against his chest a quiet anchor, his calm a contrast to the guards' growing unease, his silence a refusal to let their provocation steal his focus from Caleb's moment. The crowd's attention was now fully on the standoff, a grandmother clutching her purse tighter, a young boy tugging his mother's sleeve, asking why those men were standing, the auditorium's festive energy giving way to a taut awareness of something deeper, loyalty, honor, a father's right to his place. Caleb, watching from the student line, felt his chest tighten, pride and anger mixing as he saw his father's stillness, the same unyielding calm he'd seen when bullies taunted him as a kid, his father teaching him to stand tall without raising a fist. The Rangers' presence wasn't just support, it was a declaration, a living testament to the man Marcus was, the leader who'd carried them through hell and now sat unflinching in a plastic chair, refusing to be moved. Daniel's gaze didn't waver, his voice dropping lower. "You don't know who you're dealing with, but you're about to find out." And the words landed like a warning shot, making Reese take another step back, his confidence crumbling. The auditorium seemed to hold its breath, the stage's banners and the graduates' chatter fading into the background. The moment defined by the quiet power of men who'd faced worse than this and stood together without needing to speak. There, unity a force that shifted the room's gravity, leaving Carter and Reese exposed, their authority unraveling in the face of something far greater. The Westview Community College auditorium crackled with tension as Carter, the stocky security guard, leaned closer to Marcus Everett, his voice a low growl, threatening to call for backup if Marcus didn't vacate his front row seat, his hand twitching near his radio as if it were a weapon, while Reese, his lanky partner, hovered uneasily, his earlier bravado replaced by a nervous glance at the 5 Army Rangers standing silently across the room. Marcus sat unmoved, his army dress uniform immaculate, his hands steady on his thighs, the faded photo of Lena and baby Caleb a quiet weight against his chest, anchoring him to his purpose. to watch his son graduate, a moment he'd promised Lena he'd never miss. Daniel Pierce, the lead ranger, stood firm in the aisle, his salt-and-pepper beard framing a face carved by years of combat, his voice cutting through the charged air with a calm warning. "You touch him, and you'll answer to us." Carter's eyes darted between Marcus and Daniel, his scowl deepening. But the crowd's growing attention, parents pausing mid-conversation, students in the graduate line craning their necks, made his authority feel flimsier by the second. Javier Torres, positioned near the bleachers, crossed his arms, his lean frame radiating a quiet intensity. Ethan Cole, at the back, widened his stance, his broad shoulders a wall. Nathan Hayes, near the stage, tilted his head slightly, his scarred jaw set. And Lucas Reed, by the exit, watched with eyes that missed nothing, their collective presence a silent ultimatum that needed no words. The memory of Mosul, where Marcus had led them through a hail of bullets, bound them to this moment, there, loyalty a living force that filled the room with an unspoken promise. Carter, oblivious to the depth of that bond, snapped back, "You don't get to call shots here." But his voice cracked, betraying his faltering confidence as he noticed the crowd's eyes shifting from the stage to the standoff. A young woman in the second row clutched her program, whispering to her brother, while an older man nearby set down his coffee, his gaze fixed on Daniel's unyielding stance. Caleb, standing among the graduates, his black gown slightly askew, watched his father with a knot in his chest. His mother's eyes mirrored in his own as he sensed the weight of the moment, pride and anger warring within him. The ceremony's music had stopped, the processional halted, and the auditorium's festive hum gave way to a taut silence, broken only by the faint rustle of programs and the occasional cough. Daniel took another step forward, his voice dropping. To a near whisper, "You're making a mistake you can't undo." And the words landed like a stone, heavy with the promise of consequence. Reese, now visibly rattled, tugged at Carter's sleeve, muttering, "Let's just go, man." But Carter's pride held him fast, his hand dropping to his belt, not touching his radio but close enough to signal intent. A move Marcus read without. Flinching, his training keeping him grounded in the face of provocation. The crowd's murmurs grew, a mother in the bleachers shushing her child to watch, a teenager pausing his video recording to lean forward, the room alive with the sense that something pivotal was unfolding. Suddenly, a woman in academic regalia, the dean of students, appeared at the edge of the aisle, her face tight with urgency as she whispered sharply to Carter, her words inaudible, but her gesture clear. "Stand down." Carter hesitated, his jaw working, as if chewing on his own ego. But the dean's insistence and the ranger's unwavering presence tipped the balance, her authority cutting through his defiance. Reese stepped back fully now, his hands raised slightly as if surrendering, while Carter muttered something under his breath, his face burning red as he turned and followed the dean toward the back exit, their retreat marked by the squeak of their boots on the polished floor. The crowd exhaled, a collective release as the tension broke like a wave, some clapping softly, others nodding in quiet approval, their respect for Marcus palpable in the air. Marcus remained seated, his posture unchanged, his eyes fixed on the stage where Caleb stood, the photo in his pocket a steady reminder of why he was here, his calm a testament to a strength forged in harder battles than this. Caleb, watching from the graduate line, felt a surge of pride, his hands clenching at his sides, the image of his father's stillness burning into his memory, a lesson in dignity he'd carry forever. The rangers didn't sit immediately. Daniel lingered in the aisle, his gaze softening as he met Marcus's eyes, a nod passing between them, not of thanks but of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of a bond that didn't need words. The other rangers, Javier, Ethan, Nathan, and Lucas, remained, standing, their presence a quiet anchor, ensuring the moment held its weight. The dean returned to her seat, her face composed but her hands trembling slightly, while the crowd's attention began to shift back to the stage, the ceremony resuming with a faltering announcement of the next speaker. But the room wasn't the same. The air carried a new reverence, a shared understanding that what had just happened was more than a dispute over a seat. It was a stand for respect, for a father's right to witness his son's triumph, backed by men who'd walked through fire together. Marcus's heart beat steady, the weight of Lena's photo grounding him, his focus unwavering as he waited for Caleb's name to be called, the standoff a fleeting interruption to the promise he'd kept, the pride he felt for his son a fire that no guard could extinguish. The Westview Community College auditorium pulsed with a renewed energy as the ceremony resumed, the standoff between Marcus Everett and the security guards fading into a hushed reverence, and all eyes turned to the stage where the graduates stood ready, their black gowns swaying slightly as names began to echo through the speakers. Caleb Everett, 19 and lanky, stood near the center of the line, his honor cords draped across his shoulders, his mother Lena's thoughtful eyes reflected in his own as he adjusted his cap, his heart pounding not from nerves, but from the weight of what he'd just witnessed, his father's unwavering calm, the silent rise of the Army Rangers, and the crowd's quiet shift from curiosity to respect. As the announcer called names, the applause grew steadier, but the room's focus lingered on Marcus, still seated in the front row, his army dress uniform a beacon of dignity, his hands resting lightly on his thighs, the faded photo of Lena and baby Caleb pressing against his chest like a heartbeat. The stage was simple, adorned with a podium and a banner proclaiming Class of 2025, but it felt monumental as Caleb's turn approached, each step toward the platform carrying the weight of his journey, a boy who'd grown up in the shadow of his father's deployments, his mother's courage through illness, and the promise of a future he'd carved through late nights studying at the community college. The crowd clapped for each graduate, but the rhythm shifted when the announcer paused, her voice steady but weighted, and called Caleb Everett. A beat of silence followed. Then the auditorium erupted, the applause louder, deeper, more deliberate than before, led by the 5 Rangers, Daniel Pierce, Javier Torres, Ethan Cole, Nathan Hayes, and Lucas Reed, who stood in unison, their hands clapping in perfect sync, a tribute not just to Caleb but to Marcus, the man who'd led them through fire. Caleb stepped forward, his chin high, his steps measured, his black gown catching the light as he crossed the stage, the diploma folder in the principal's hand a symbol of his grit, his mother's dreams, and his father's unyielding support. Marcus locked eyes with his son, their gaze a bridge across years of absence, hospital rooms and quiet kitchen talks, a shared understanding that needed no words, Lena's absence a silent presence, her love woven into this moment. The crowd felt it too, strangers standing, some clapping harder, others wiping tears they couldn't explain, the applause swelling into a wave that carried more than celebration. It was a collective nod to a father's stand, a son's triumph, and the invisible bonds that held them together. Caleb shook the principal's hand, his grip firm, and turned to face the audience, his eyes finding Marcus instantly, the smallest smile breaking through his composed expression, a mirror of his father's own subtle grin. The Rangers' applause continued, their hands moving like a drumbeat, a salute without fanfare, each clap a declaration of loyalty to the man who'd carried them through Mosul's chaos and now sat quietly, letting his son's moment shine. A woman in the third row, her glasses fogging slightly, stood and clapped, her husband following, their cheers joining a chorus that seemed to say, "We see you, both of you." Caleb stepped off the stage, his diploma in hand, his heart racing with a pride that wasn't just for himself but for the man who'd driven 10 hours, faced down prejudice, and stayed rooted in that plastic chair, unmoved by anything but love. The auditorium's energy shifted, the clapping lingering longer than for others, as if the crowd understood they'd witnessed something rare, a moment where dignity and loyalty outshone the ordinary, where a father's quiet strength became a beacon for all. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Caleb, the photo in his pocket a steady anchor, its worn edges a reminder of the family he'd fought for, in war and in peace. The other graduates continued, but their steps seemed to echo. In the wake of Caleb's moment, the room alive with a shared reverence that didn't need explanation, a sense that this wasn't just about a diploma, but about a legacy carried forward. A young girl in the bleachers tugged her father's sleeve, asking why everyone was clapping so loud, and he whispered, "Because that boy's dad is a hero." His words simple but heavy, catching the ear of an older couple nearby who nodded in quiet agreement. Caleb rejoined the graduate line, his shoulders squared, his mother's eyes shining with a mix of pride and resolve, the memory of his father's stillness and the ranger's silent stand burning into his soul, a lesson in what it meant to carry our name with honor. The ceremony pressed on, names blending into a steady rhythm, but the auditorium held onto the weight of that moment, the air charged with a respect that transcended the stage, the banners, the balloons drifting above. Marcus sat back, his posture unchanged, his heart loosening with a quiet release, not grief, not pain, but the feeling of a circle closing, a promise kept to Lena, a milestone shared with Caleb. The crowd's cheers for the next graduate were warm, but they couldn't match the depth of what had just passed, a moment that would linger in the minds of everyone there, a story of a father, a son, and the men who stood with them, their silence louder than any shout. The Westview Community College parking lot glowed under the soft hues of a Georgia evening, the sky streaked with pink and gold as the last families drifted away, their voices fading into the hum of cicadas, leaving Marcus Everett and his son, Caleb, in a quiet pocket of the bustling aftermath. Marcus stood by the auditorium's exit, his army dress uniform still sharp, the weight of the faded photo of Lena and baby Caleb tucked against his chest, a silent tether to the vow he'd kept, to be here for his son's graduation. Caleb, his gown now unzipped, stood near the flagpole, diploma folder in one hand, his lanky frame catching the dying light as he scanned the crowd for his father, his mother's thoughtful eyes bright with the day's emotions. They met near the old Ford pickup, the truck Lena had loved for their family drives, its worn paint a canvas of memories, weekend picnics, her singing off-key to the radio. Caleb's voice broke the stillness, asking if Marcus was okay, the guard's earlier challenge still a raw edge in his mind, and Marcus nodded, his hand finding Caleb's shoulder, saying, "You made us proud up there," his words carrying a warmth that softened the weight of the day. Caleb admitted he'd wanted to storm off the stage when he saw the guards, his fists clenching at the memory. But Marcus's steady gaze held him, his reply calm. "You didn't, because you trusted me to handle it. You owned your moment." They climbed into the truck, the cab a warm haven of leather and faint traces of Lena's favorite lavender air freshener, and Caleb asked why Marcus stayed so quiet during the standoff, his voice a mix of admiration and curiosity. Marcus turned the ignition, the engine's rumble a low hum, and pulled out the photo, passing it to Caleb, who held it like a relic, Lena's smile vivid despite the worn edges. "I learned long ago," Marcus said, his voice steady, "that you don't need to shout to be heard. You stand firm, let your actions speak, and the world listens." Caleb nodded, his fingers tracing the photo, and said softly, "I want to carry that kind of strength." Marcus's eyes crinkled. "You already do, son. You walk that stage like a man who knows who he is." The Rangers approached, Daniel, Pierce at the fore, his grizzled face softening as he gripped Marcus's hand, saying, "We wouldn't have missed it," while Javier, Ethan, Nathan, and Lucas offered quiet nods, their presence a final chord of the loyalty that had defined the day. As they dispersed to their cars, Daniel lingered, his voice low. "You ever need us, you know where we are." And Marcus returned a nod, a silent pact renewed. Caleb watched them go, his chest tight with a pride he couldn't fully name, and Marcus turned to him. "Your call on dinner." Caleb grinned. Waffle House always, and Marcus's chuckle filled the cab, a rare sound that felt like home. They drove to the diner, the road unfurling under a sky now dotted with stars, and settled into a booth, the neon glow casting warmth over their table as they ordered coffee and hash browns, Caleb laughing about a classmate's speech flub. Marcus leaned back, watching his son, the day's weight easing into a quiet joy. Lena's memory alive in Caleb's easy smile, her love a thread weaving through their shared silence. "She'd have been out there cheering loudest," Marcus said, his voice soft, and Caleb nodded, his eyes glistening. "And fixing my chords 100 times." They sat, father and son, the world outside blurring into the night, their bond a steady flame that no challenge could dim, the day a marker of not just a diploma, but a legacy of dignity and love that Caleb would carry forward, shaped by a father who taught him that silence, when rooted in truth, echoes forever.